Imagine being trapped in a place where winter never ends, where temperatures drop below -50 degrees Celsius. Escape is impossible, and survival itself becomes a daily battle. Welcome to the Siberian Gulags, the coldest, cruelest prisons on Earth. The Siberian Gulags were not merely prisons. They were sprawling networks of forced labor camps created under Joseph Stalin's rule during the Soviet Union's darkest years. Born from a mix of fear, control, and political ambition, these camps became symbols of absolute power and human suffering. The Gulag system began as a method to punish criminals and political dissidents, but it quickly evolved into a mechanism to silence anyone who dared to think differently or speak against the regime. Stretching across the icy wilderness of Siberia, these camps were deliberately placed in some of the most remote and inhospitable regions on Earth, places where escape was impossible and even survival seemed unlikely. The Soviet government used the frozen land as both a natural prison and a tool of terror. Millions of people were arrested under vague charges of anti-Soviet activities or counter-revolutionary behavior, often without trial. Many were intellectuals, soldiers, religious figures, and ordinary citizens who simply fell victim to paranoia or false accusations. The journey to the gulags itself was often deadly. Prisoners were packed into overcrowded train cars, enduring weeks of travel through freezing temperatures without food, water, or sanitation. By the time they arrived, many were already near death. Those who survived faced a new nightmare: endless days of grueling labor, cutting timber, mining, or building railways in the unforgiving Siberian cold. The establishment of the Gulag system served a dual purpose for Stalin's regime. It instilled fear among the population and fueled industrial growth through cheap, expendable labor. Every hammer strike, every log cut, and every mine dug by prisoners was part of a larger political machine powered by human misery. The Gulags became an invisible empire of suffering, hidden behind propaganda, yet known to every Soviet citizen as a place where one could vanish without a trace. It was a world built on control and silence, where millions of lives were destroyed in the name of progress and power. Life inside the Siberian Gulags was a descent into unending misery, a world stripped of warmth, comfort, and hope. The environment itself was an enemy. Temperatures in many camps plummeted to as low as -50 degrees Celsius, -58 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing exposed skin within seconds. Prisoners were forced to live in crude wooden barracks, poorly insulated and overcrowded, with thin straw mattresses that offered little protection against the cold. Many shared rags or torn blankets, desperately trying to stay alive through nights that felt eternal. Food was scarce and barely edible. A typical meal consisted of watery soup made from cabbage or potato peels, a slice of coarse bread, and occasionally a spoonful of porridge. Starvation was a constant companion. Those too weak to work received even less food, creating a cruel cycle of hunger and exhaustion that slowly consumed the body. Malnutrition led to diseases like scurvy and dysentery, and medical care was almost non-existent. Work was relentless. From dawn until nightfall, prisoners were forced into back-breaking labor, cutting timber, mining coal, or constructing railroads in the frozen wilderness. Tools were primitive, clothing inadequate, and supervision brutal. Guards enforced quotas, and those who failed to meet them were beaten, isolated, or denied rations. The combination of extreme cold and endless labor claimed thousands of lives each year. Hygiene was impossible. Lice, disease, and infection spread rapidly in the unheated barracks. Bathing was a rare luxury, and latrines often froze solid during winter, leaving unbearable stench and filth. Death was so common that corpses were sometimes left outside until the ground thawed enough to bury them. But perhaps the most haunting part of Gulag life was the psychological torment. Prisoners were stripped not only of freedom but of identity. Names were replaced with numbers, individuality was crushed under the weight of survival. Conversations were monitored, friendships could mean betrayal, and hope itself became dangerous. The constant fear of punishment, or simply being forgotten, gnawed at the human spirit more cruelly than the cold ever could. Every day in the Gulag was a fight to remain human in a place designed to erase humanity. The frozen winds howled outside the fences, but inside, the silence was heavier. The silence of people too weak to speak, too afraid to dream, and too broken to remember what freedom once felt like. Survival in the Siberian Gulags was not about living, it was about enduring. In a place where death was an everyday occurrence, to wake up each morning was itself an act of defiance. The men and women trapped within those icy fences learned that survival required more than strength. It demanded cunning, adaptability, and an unbreakable will to live even when life had lost its meaning. The prisoners were forced to become resourceful in ways that defied imagination. Some tore strips from their clothing to make makeshift gloves or boots. Others traded small scraps of bread, a few matches, or even a word of encouragement, the only currency left in a world stripped of everything human. A piece of soap or a threadbare coat could mean the difference between life and death. Friendship became both a lifeline and a risk. Trusting someone could save your life, but it could also destroy you. Informers were everywhere, and one careless word could lead to punishment or execution. Yet despite the fear, bonds formed among prisoners. They shared food, stories, and memories of home. In these rare moments of connection, humanity flickered like a fragile flame against the cold. Some found strength in faith or ideology, others in the stubborn refusal to let their captors destroy their spirit. Prisoners secretly carved crosses, scribbled poems on scraps of paper, or whispered forbidden songs in the darkness. These small acts of rebellion were not just about hope. They were declarations that even in chains they were still human. The harsh environment tested every aspect of endurance. Frostbite would claim fingers and toes, yet many continued to work, driven by the instinct to survive one more day. Hunger gnawed constantly, but imagination became a weapon. Prisoners would describe elaborate meals or recall the smell of bread back home, fooling their minds into tasting life again. There were rare escape attempts, desperate, often doomed ventures across hundreds of miles of snow and ice. Those who tried knew the odds. The wilderness itself was deadlier than the guards. Yet some still ran, believing that even dying free in the frozen tundra was better than living one more day behind the wire. Survival in the gulags was not measured in years but in moments. A shared smile, a stolen breath of warm air, a glimpse of the sun through barbed wire. These fragments of humanity became the soul's armor. Against a regime that sought to break the body and erase the spirit, survival itself became the ultimate victory. The legacy of the Siberian Gulags is one of haunting silence. A silence that echoes across generations, frozen in time yet alive in memory. Though the camps themselves have long since fallen into ruin, their impact endures, shaping not only the history of Russia but the world's understanding of oppression, resilience, and human cruelty. When the Gulag system finally collapsed after Stalin's death, the scale of its horror began to emerge. Historians estimate that millions passed through these camps between the 1930s and 1950s, with countless others dying before their names could ever be recorded. The exact number of victims remains uncertain, buried under decades of secrecy and denial. For the survivors, freedom did not bring peace. They returned to a world that often refused to believe their stories or that treated them as criminals rather than victims. The scars of the Gulag were not just physical, they were generational. Families were torn apart, children grew up never knowing the fate of their parents, and communities were forever fractured by fear and distrust. Even today, the descendants of those imprisoned carry the weight of that trauma, the inherited silence of people who were taught that speaking the truth could cost them everything. On a global scale, the revelations about the Gulags forced humanity to confront the terrifying reality of what political power, unchecked and unchallenged, can do. They became a warning, a symbol of how ideology, when placed above compassion, can justify unimaginable suffering. The Gulags were not only a Soviet tragedy, they were a human one, a mirror reflecting the darkest capacities of control and obedience. In modern Russia, debates continue about how the Gulags should be remembered. Some memorials stand in places where the camps once operated, their wooden crosses and rusted fences preserved as silent witnesses to a nation's buried truth. Museums and archives attempt to document the suffering, while others seek to minimize or rewrite the past. Yet the frozen ground of Siberia still holds the bones of the lost, an unspoken reminder that history cannot be erased, no matter how deeply it's buried beneath the snow. Beyond Russia, the Gulag legacy inspired global discussions on human rights, freedom of expression, and political accountability. It taught the world that justice is not guaranteed, it must be protected even from those who claim to defend it. The story of the Gulags is not just about death and despair, it is about the resilience of the human spirit. For every life that was taken, another voice rose. A writer, a historian, a survivor, determined to ensure that the world would never forget. And though the Arctic winds may still blow over the abandoned camps, their whispers carry a message that transcends time. Never again. As the cold winds still sweep across the empty Siberian tundra, the remains of the Gulag stand as silent monuments to human suffering and endurance. The rusted fences, crumbling watchtowers, and forgotten graves whisper a truth that cannot be buried. That even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit refuses to be broken. The story of the Siberian Gulags is not just a chapter in Russian history, it is a warning written in ice and blood, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and when fear becomes a nation's law. Yet within that darkness, we also find light. The courage of those who endured, the resilience of those who survived, and the voices of those who refused to be silenced. Today, as we remember their pain, we also honor their strength. The gulags may have been built to erase humanity, but in the end, they revealed its deepest truth, that even in the coldest places on earth, the fire of the human soul can never be extinguished.